A new ceasefire in Syria. Trump and Putin broker a pause in the fighting. Does this mean the leader of Syria's regime is as secure as he's ever been? I'm Imran Gupta, and today's newsmaker is Bashar al-Assad. A ceasefire came into effect in southern Syria on Sunday. Yet in the past few days, the regime has seized several opposition-held villages. And in return, rebels say they've shot down a regime plane. But while the deal seems to be having little impact on the ground and in the skies, it's significant for the message it sends to the world. Assad is staying put for the foreseeable future. The US brokered the deal in cooperation with Assad's biggest supporter, Russia. And despite tough talk and some military action from the Trump administration, the latest move appears to only solidify Assad's position. Long gone is the rhetoric of removing him, and demands for a political transition have become more muted. So, is Assad as strong as ever? And after overseeing the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of his own people, does Syria really have no viable alternative? We begin with this report from Shuaib Hassan.
It's the latest sign that he may have survived the worst and is now here to stay. That's why Bashar al-Assad's forces continue to press the offensive while ignoring ceasefires like this one in Sweden. Rebels say they have shot down a Syrian regime jet here, hours after Damascus captured territory in the region. It happens as Assad's position continues to strengthen and the international coalition pushes for a complete end to hostilities.
When two superpowers, Russian Federation, which is an ally of President Assad, and the United States of America agree fundamentally at that level in trying to make that ceasefire work, there is a strong chance that that will take place.
That's emboldened Assad's regime to go on the offensive. They might want to recapture as much territory as possible before any deal is reached, as any arrangement could partition the country. But such rapprochement with Assad has led to an outcry among the moderate rebel groups.
When we heard the announcement of the tripartite deal between the Americans, Russians and Jordanians, which orders the withdrawal from the southwest of Hauran or the southern Syria area in general, honestly, we hoped this fulfills the goals which we called for. The battle cry "death over humiliation" that erupted aims to liberate our land from our enemy, Assad.
The Syrian leader is more than happy to oblige. Here, destruction by barrel bombs, and there the use of munitions that gas civilians to death. It's a remarkable comeback for a man whose writ was reduced to the outskirts of Damascus. That was in late 2012, a year and a half after a military crackdown turned Arab Spring protests in Syria into an armed insurgency. But timely support from Russia and Iran ensured that he survived and managed to push back the strongest rebel offensives, and finally routed them in Aleppo.
How can you liberate the civilians in those areas from the terrorists? Is it better to leave them under their supervision, under their oppression, under their fate defined by those terrorists, by beheading, by killing, by everything, but not having state? Is that the role of the state, just to keep and watch? You have to liberate, and this is the price sometimes, but at the end, the people are liberated from the terrorists.
That price comes at the cost of 11 million Syrians having fled their homes and more than 250,000 dead. That's something Assad appears to be at peace with, as the rest of the world falls in line. Shuaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Cardiff by Syria analyst Ayman Jawad Tamimi, and in London, Alexander Nekrasov. He's a former advisor to the Kremlin. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Ayman Tamimi, if I can begin with you, sir, is Assad as strong as ever?
Yes. I definitely say so. I mean, he is as strong as ever. He controls the most important urban centers in Syria, most of Damascus, Homs and Aleppo city, not to mention the coastal cities of Latakia and Tartus. Whereas the opposition, so to speak, only has Idlib and parts of Deraa, these isolated pockets in the north and south of the country. And so, you know, if it's a question of who controls most important assets in the country, the choice between the opposition and Assad, then of course it's Assad. So definitely his position is as strong as ever. And I think that over time, also with this new ceasefire, it'll help solidify things even more if the ceasefire holds. I mean, for example, Assad and his allies could divert some manpower from the south, say, and help bolster even more the push eastwards towards the borders of Iraq and into the Deir ez-Zor province, the oil-rich province of Syria, you know, backed both by Russia and Iran in this regard. Russia with airstrikes chiefly, and Iran with supplying both client militiamen and also some ground personnel.
Okay, Alexander Nekrasov, is Assad's strong position right now all down to Russian and Iranian support?
Of course it is, because take out the Russian troops and the Iranian troops and support, and that's it. Assad is finished. But I think that this latest ceasefire, it practically doesn't change anything. It was obviously negotiated for that meeting between Trump and Putin in Germany, and they wanted to have some sort of a result coming out of it. I don't really see that it will hold. I suspect it's not even holding already. Now, I can tell you something a bit of an exclusive. A team of Russian independent journalists have just returned from Syria, and they showed me some of the footage they have done on the ground in different parts of Syria and in some of the small towns besieged by ISIS fighters and so on. So what I have seen there is that supplies are continuing to come to the ISIS fighters. The reinforcements are coming still. So how can we say that things are changing in Syria and that Assad is strengthening his position when some countries are continuing their support and we don't know which ones are doing that?
If I may ask you, Mr. Nekrasov, which towns and cities were you looking at in that footage?
Well, I can't tell you now because I didn't pay attention to the names. One of the cities has 100,000 people in it, and they are besieged by ISIS. They have only 2 helicopters that bring in supplies, and ISIS are basically waiting to storm it, and they're promising to kill everyone.
But how do you know it's ISIS?
This footage will be released. Sorry?
How do you know it's ISIS?
No, they've been inside. They've been inside. They filmed from the air. They filmed everything. So the people inside the town told them stories of horrific slaughter and so on. So it's not something that I've made up. It's caught on camera.
I'm just trying to sort of pass this out. I mean, you say they were Russian independent journalists. Independent how? I mean, were they affiliated with anyone, or they're completely independent?
No, they're independent journalists. They make this footage and they sell it to companies that would like to buy it, basically. So that they have nothing to do with any governments or anything. So these are just people who make money out of this footage.
Okay, so that's something interesting coming from Alexander Nekrasov. He's a man who's connected. Ayman, does that sound plausible to you, that Daesh in Syria is still getting support from somewhere?
I'll just comment on 2 things. In terms of the siege situation he's talking about Deir ez-Zor city, which is the parts of it still held by the regime. Yeah, they are being besieged by the Islamic State. And I think around 100,000 people, that's probably an accurate number. What seems less plausible, though, is this idea of still getting supplies from unnamed foreign states. I think the problem in the Deir ez-Zor area is that, you know, there's still border connections between Iraq and Syria, that the Islamic State can move through and move personnel and move weapons they still have. In terms of access to, you know, say weapons from the international black market or things like this, or from the outside world, this is much more restricted now because the Islamic State no longer has any access to the border with Turkey. They were driven off it by Syrian rebel forces backed by Turkey back in the summer of 2016.
Right. So, Ayman, I want to bring up the point of Syrian rebel forces. And Alexander Nekrasov, I know this is where you and Ayman will disagree about who's a rebel and who's not. And Mr. Nekrasov, we've had a ding-dong about this multiple times about who's a moderate rebel and who's not. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole again. But Ayman, if we take, say, Daesh, ISIS, and Jabhat Fatah Sham, the former Nusra Front, let's park them off to the side. All the other rebel forces, those who are currently fighting right now, besides those groups, who's supporting them? Which countries are supporting them? Or have they been abandoned by the international community?
No, they have a variety of different international backers. And then there's the question of, well, what's the scale of the support and what does the country backing them have in mind when they give that support to that group? So if we take the South, which is, of course, in terms of what we're talking about with the ceasefire, the main backers there is the Jordan, Gulf states, and some Western countries through an operations room in Amman. And it's to a very broad coalition of groups known as the Southern Front, or they go by the label of Free Syrian Army as well. But as far as we're talking about with this coalition, and what the international backers want, it's not really, you know, let's use this force in the south to push on Damascus and overthrow Assad. On the contrary, it's far more, I think at best you can call it conflict calibration. You know, where it's trying to prevent one side from, it seems, from gaining a decisive victory for fear, for example, that you'll create lots of more refugee flows into Jordan.
Ayman, was that, sorry to interrupt you, was that because the Russians, sorry to interrupt you, was that because the Russians and the Iranians forced or imposed their will on this conflict over the past few months?
I would say, actually, when you take the case of the South and Jordan, this is a thing that's been a lot more long-term than, say, the decisive gains that Assad has made in the past year or so. Jordan, I think, for a long time was not too keen on the idea of a push from the south to take Damascus by the rebels, because they were very concerned about refugee flows. Then when we take Israel, another country that gives select backing to some more independent groups in the border with the Golan Heights, that too is also about conflict calibration, trying to prevent the Iranians and their clients from having free access to the border of the Golan Heights, while at the same time Israel doesn't want Druze communities in the Quneitra area to be endangered by some of the rebel groups. So again, it seems to be in the south about conflict calibration, rather than backing one side for a decisive victory.
Alexander Nekrasov, the last time I spoke to you about this, Donald Trump had bombed Syrian regime positions after the Syrians had used chemical attacks or chemical weapons against their own people. There was a suggestion then that the United States was going to be muscly and aggressive against the Syrian regime. Since then, Trump hasn't done much. He seems to have been in lockstep with Russia. Did you expect all of this to happen? And what does this say now? What does this say about the American view of this conflict?
Well, first of all, in Moscow, they are still puzzled what is exactly the American position on Syria, because just days before the meeting in Hamburg between Putin and Trump, the Americans started peddling this idea that Assad is planning another chemical attack, and they were hinting they were going to strike the regime again. And this came out of nowhere. The Russians were totally taken aback by that. And then, of course, different sort of signals are coming from Washington all the time.
But maybe they had intel, right?
Assad has to go.
But Mr. Nekrasov, maybe they had intel that he might have wanted to, and he didn't, right?
Well, you might say that, but it all sounded very unconvincing. But it also sounds very, you know, sort of confusing for Moscow, because there is no practical policy. I think, my personal opinion, I think that Trump's administration wants Russia to sink in further in the conflict in Syria. I think that's the general line, although they are playing this game of we are going to fight together against IS and so on. That is what is happening, and Russia is trying to basically find a solution like we saw in Astana talks and all those de-escalation zones, which won't work, unfortunately. Russia is trying to find a formula where it can start pulling out its troops. It doesn't want to get bogged down in another type of Afghanistan. America is actually not allowing Russia to leave. And that is the situation we are witnessing now.
You say the Russians want to leave.
Between Trump, I think they want to leave. I want any country would want to leave such a conflict. And unfortunately, the meeting in Hamburg on the sidelines between Trump and Putin didn't really, reveal any solutions or any, sort of narrowing of positions between the two countries.
Right. Let's go to Ayman. Ayman, the battle for Raqqa, as many of us expect, now that Mosul has been retaken by the Iraqi army, Daesh has been kicked out there in Iraq. There seems to be the suggestion that Raqqa is next and that there's a hope that Daesh will be ousted from Raqqa. How likely is that, Ayman? And would that be overall a good thing in this conflict?
Okay, I think it is likely that they would be ousted from Raqqa. And to be sure, I think the Islamic State's own messaging has been trying to address that possibility, and even to the point of conceding that it will happen in their messaging since, around, say, May of 2016, last year, when their spokesman put out his last speech, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, before he was killed in August 2016. But in May 2016, he put out a speech where he did say he mocked the US idea, or the supposed US idea, that losing Raqqa, Mosul, and then Sirte in Libya would mean the end of the Islamic State as a caliphate project. So yeah, I do think it's going to happen, and the Islamic State's own messaging seems to be partly addressing that. Whether it's a good thing, it really just does depend on how the city is administered afterwards.
Right.
I think the challenge foremost is to have, credible, representative local governance in the city.
Right. Yeah, and looking at who is doing that, taking over the city or fighting Daesh, you have the SDF, of which a large part is the YPG, considered by Turkey as a terrorist organization. They've got weapons from the Americans. The Americans say once they go in and they destroy Daesh, the YPG has promised them they'll give them their weapons back. So, Ayman, is the general who writes up these talking points a comedian, or do the Americans really believe that the YPG is going to hand the weapons back and they're just going to retreat back to their old positions?
To be honest, I think the American messaging tends to be very, very confused about this. And in the same way, for example, when they've tried to say the YPG is not linked to the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and they've tried to say, well, there's no link, and there's proof it's not the case, it's really to the point almost of insulting Turkey in this regard. The fact is that the YPG is basically the Syrian affiliate of the PKK. And I don't think they'd want to give their weapons back to the Americans either. In the end, the YPG really, or its political wing, the PYD, in most of the towns that have been taken, they're the ones who hold the keys of power, so to speak. And in turn, this is people who are PKK cadres, essentially. And in terms of how they'll strike their regional alliances, it really just depends on what the situation is. If they think the Americans abandon them, I'm sure they'll strike many more deals with the Syrian regime in Russia. Yeah,
it's set to further complicate the situation in northern Syria. Gentlemen, it's been good to have this discussion. Ayman Jawad Tamimi and Alexander Nekrasov, thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, France funds a new fighting force in Africa. What's President Macron's plan for the Sahel, and will it work? And on the anniversary of the Camp David summit, we ask Israel's former foreign minister if peace between Israelis and Palestinians is as far away as ever. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. French President Emmanuel Macron has launched a new multinational force to fight militants in West Africa. He's promised troops and funding to 5 countries in the Sahel region. They'll be working alongside UN troops in what's the deadliest peacekeeping posting in the world. Since coming to office, Macron has made a strong French engagement in Africa a cornerstone of his foreign policy. But he's now come under fire for controversial comments that seem to suggest Africa's problems are due to its civilization. Is Macron taking the right approach, with France spearheading what they're calling the G5 Sahel bloc? Will injecting a few thousand more troops into the region help eliminate extremism or further fan the flames of war? We begin with this report from Yvette McCullough.
A new multinational force set to fight armed groups in the Sahel region. An anti-terror operation with the backing of the French president.
Parce que c'est ici que se joue la sécurité du continent africain et plus largement la sécurité d'une bonne partie de notre planète, y compris de l'Europe.
The task force will include troops from the so-called G5 Sahel, Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Niger and Chad. The 5,000-strong force will bolster the 12,000 UN peacekeepers and France's 4,000 troops. The task force will focus on 3 border zones, one along the frontier between Niger and Mali, another between Mali and Mauritania, and a third straddling the borders between Burkina Faso, Niger and Mali. France says it will contribute $9 million by the end of the year, and the EU has also pledged $57 million.
Le président Macron a souhaité l'avènement d'une alliance pour le Sahel. C'est une belle chose. Et il est clair également aussi que la France seule ne peut pas continuer à supporter le fardeau de cette lutte contre le terrorisme qui concerne le monde entier.
Paris considers the Sahel a breeding ground for militants and traffickers who pose a threat to Europe. In 2012, groups with links to Al-Qaeda seized control of Mali's desert north. Though they were driven back a year later by a French-led military intervention, various armed groups still carry out attacks in the region.
Jour à affronter des terroristes, des voyous, des assassins, dont nous devons oublier le nom et le visage, mais que nous devons, avec constance, détermination, tous ensemble, éradiquer. Éradiquer parce qu'ils le font aujourd'hui, au nom de la division des peuples.
But some speculate this move is a way for France to reduce its burden and slowly draw down its troops in the region, something Macron has played down, saying Paris will remain engaged for as long as it takes. When Macron came to power, he brought hope that he would have a different approach to French-African relations, with a focus on helping African nations to help themselves through tangible economic development. A message he brought to last week's G20 summit in Hamburg. But there has been social media backlash at some of his comments during a press conference, where he said that the problems in Africa are civilizational.
C'est par le biais d'une gouvernance plus rigoureuse, de la lutte contre la corruption, d'une lutte pour la bonne gouvernance, d'une transition démographique réussie. Quand des pays ont encore aujourd'hui 7 à 8 enfants par femme, vous pouvez décider d'y dépenser des milliards d'euros, vous ne stabiliserez rien.
Although a video being shared online has been edited out of context, his language is being seen as a misstep, raising questions about whether Macron's approach to Africa will be that different to his predecessors, and whether his strategy for the continent will succeed where other leaders have failed. Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, to get more on this, I'm joined now from Paris by Anne Le Breton. She's a deputy mayor of a district in Paris and a member of the French president's En Marche party. In Washington, D.C., Camisa Camara, she's the founder and co-chair of the Sahel Strategy Forum. And in Malta's capital, Valletta, we have Abdulkader Abdulrahman. He's a peace and security analyst specializing in the Sahel and North Africa region. Gentlemen, thank you very much, Mr. Abdulrahman, and ladies, thank you very much for joining us. Let me begin with you, Anne Le Breton. Some comments at G20 by the president. I want to get this out of the way before we look at the Sahel and the military situation. His comments about Africa and the fact that women who have 7 or 8 kids are exacerbating the problem, the fact that some of Africa's problems are civilizational, Was that a big mistake from the French president, Anne?
It's his way of doing things. He has a very complex mind, and he does put different words on things that are usually not talked about this way. And people are getting used to it, but you have to kind of follow his thought. I don't think it was a mistake.
Okay. Anne doesn't think it was a mistake. Kamisa Kamara, was it a mistake?
I think these comments were very clumsy. It was on those same premises that France colonized Africa. So I think that it really does question President Macron's judgment in terms of how the way he wants to interact with Africans.
Okay, so Anne says it wasn't a mistake. Kamisa says it was clumsy. Abdelkader, what do you think about those comments?
Well, I think that when you say something like this once, it's a mistake. When you repeat it at different times, you cannot call it a mistake. And I think that Macron, for the past few months or even years, has been used to making such comments, or clumsy, as we mentioned, clumsy comments.
Right. So, Kamisa, let's take those comments and now take them a bit further. They are happening at the same time as this new policy, where France has this security agreement with these other African countries. They want to root out extremism, particularly in the Sahel region. Do you trust President Macron to spearhead this effort?
Yeah, I do. I mean, France's efforts in the Sahel region have been really great. I mean, they have definitely helped, for example, Mali get out of a huge crisis in 2013. I mean, the national territory was threatened by rebels, and France's intervention in Mali definitely saved the country. Now, when we look at France's strategy in the Sahel region, I think that what Macron is trying to do is he's trying to create a new strategy for the Sahel countries, and he's trying to exit from the region because France has been so heavily invested over the past 5 years. So I think that the comments that he made, to come back to your first question, again, were clumsy. They might raise doubts about his intentions, but I think France as a country has been so much involved in the Sahel and has helped the Sahel region secure its borders so much for the past, I don't know how many years, that this will not be put into question by comments.
Okay. Abdelkader, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
yes.
so Abdelkader, do you think that this G5 Sahel force is necessary and it will achieve its objectives? Injecting 5,000 more French troops, is it going to solve the problem?
I think that it's not because you have a hammer that every nail is a problem. And when it comes to Mali, when it comes to the whole Sahel, I think that the military intervention is something that has to be done to be well thought before doing. I mean, as it was said, it is true that military intervention, French military intervention in 2013 was necessary. Yet, what have been the results so far? This is something we have to ask. The question is, why is the French military so present in the region? The question we have to ask, do the French want to fight terrorism? Do they really want to defeat terrorism? Or is there something behind this? And I think, in my view, the question is, what is at stake in the region for France? This is the first thing. The second thing, I think that when it comes to the G5, it's only a duplication of what has been done in the past in the Sahel or in the region. We have to remember that a few days before the G5 was launched, the African Union launched the Nouakchott process.
Right.
And at the end of the day, we have to ask, what is the G5 for?
Okay, so what is the G5 for, Anne Le Breton? Is it really necessary? Do those countries like Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger need France? Do they need France to solve their problems?
Well, up to now, you know, it's a tradition. We have this special relationship with that part of Africa. And I think definitely Emmanuel Macron, it's also because of his generation, will be more onto moving into a different kind of relationship, maybe, you know, breaking away from all the old networks. He's definitely somebody who believes that Africa is, you know, a real chance for peace, and that the development of Africa is a key element of our own stability. So we're going to have maybe a more modern relationship with Africa.
Camisa, there's a theory that this little boost is to win before pulling out. So this is a little spike before ultimately withdrawing from all the bases, all the historic military relationships in that part of Africa. Does that sound reasonable to you, Camisa?
Not really. I think the G5 Sahel should be seen as a local initiative. It is a local initiative that has been backed by France, and France has been the architect of the UN resolution that was presented to the UN Security Council to allow those local forces to be deployed in the Sahel region. So the G5 Sahel is definitely a local initiative backed by France. It should be seen that way. Is it a necessary force? It is. I think that the UN mission in Mali has a specific role. The Operation Barkhane in Chad has a specific role. Now the G5 Sahel will be manned with local troops that are not considered UN peacekeeping forces. There are considered local troops that are requesting support from France and other donors. And I think France in this case is considered as more of a donor and a big brother than anything else. Yeah,
well, I've been reading some reports that says that some of these countries might rehat existing peacekeepers. So that's a bit of a cosmetic shuffle, if you like. Be that as it may. Camisa, let me ask you. You have porous borders. While the current trouble, the main trouble, might be centered in Mali, the trouble is all around the region. You have these groups that don't have a particular geography. They're not like, say, ISIS in Iraq or Syria. They don't have a town or city as strongholds, right? So with all of that in mind, aren't you afraid that the French military is going to get sucked into a quagmire from which it can't untangle?
I don't think so. I think France's mission in the Sahel is pretty clear. It's just that when you look at Operation Barkhane, for example, or the UN mission in Mali, these forces do not have a specific mandate that allows them to tackle terrorism in the Sahel region. The new G5 Sahel has that mandate and will work in those borders to tackle terrorism specifically. I think that there have been some additional development components to the G5 Sahel, but really its main mission is to tackle terrorism. So yeah, is it a useful mission? It is. Are the troops going to be reassigned? They might be, because those countries cannot be invested in the Operation Barkhane, in the UN mission and in the G5 Sahel as it currently stands. But I think, again, the G5 Sahel is a local initiative that needs to be supported by those countries who want to secure their borders, and they are taking ownership of their own security.
Okay, Abdelkader Abdurrahman, are you convinced by any of that?
Not at all, not at all. Firstly, concerning Macron, I think we must be careful not to be fooled by the French president. The French president has done a great work presenting a very lovely, hype, or perhaps even exotic image. French President Macron is a young, charming, good-looking man. He's married to a lady who is 20 years older than him, and all this is part of the package deal. It is a way to present himself as someone new, someone who is bringing a new policy. But at the end of the day, He's representing a country, he's representing his country, and with its own interests in the Sahel and in the whole region. Now, concerning the G5, I think that one thing that strikes me is that last week, for instance, the ministers of interiors of Portugal, Spain, and Morocco, as well as the French ambassador, met in Sevilla. And we're talking about they met to discuss the issue of Sahel, questions of terrorism, crime, drug trafficking, etc. And at the end of the day, what do we get? We get those people there meeting, gathering, and none of those protagonists, the direct protagonists, were invited. So at the end of the day, we have to ask, why is that for?
Okay. Let me ask Anne then. Anne, your anti-establishment candidate who promised change is doing the same old thing his predecessors did. That's what Abdul Qadir is saying. Is that unfair?
Abdul Qadir said mainly that we were going to look out for our own interests. And of course we are, because that's, what you do. But I think our own interests in this case are definitely to have a more peaceful Africa, a more prosperous Africa, and to work, together. So we are going to be working in that way for our own interest.
Okay, it's been good to get all your thoughts. Thanks so much for joining us, Anne Le Breton, Kamisa Kamara, and Abdul Qadir Abdurrahman. Thank you very much.
This is another delusional UNESCO decision. This time they have determined that the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron is a Palestinian site, in other words, not Jewish, and that the site is endangered. Not a Jewish site? Who is buried there? Our forefathers and mothers. And that it is in danger? Only where Israel is present, like in Hebron, is freedom of worship ensured for everybody. Throughout the Middle East, mosques, churches and synagogues are being blown up, places where Israel is not present. So we will continue to guard the cave of the patriarchs, to ensure religious freedom for everybody, and we will continue also to guard the truth.
Israel is furious that the UN has declared an ancient tomb in the West Bank city of Hebron a Palestinian site. Anger and animosity between the two sides seems as high as ever. 17 years ago today, US President Bill Clinton convened a landmark meeting between the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat at a retreat in the US state of Maryland. It was the Camp David Summit, and it went down in infamy for the high expectations going into it and its complete failure to reach a deal. Almost 2 decades on, Israel continues its occupation and building of settlements in Palestinian territories, and Palestinians continue attacking Israeli soldiers. So, are the prospects for peace as dim as they've ever been? Well, joining me now from Tel Aviv is Shlomo bin Ami. He's Israel's former foreign minister who now serves as the vice president of the Toledo International Center for Peace. Sir, thank you very much for joining us. Looking at the historical timeline, it's been 50 years of occupation, 50 years since Israel seized the West Bank and Gaza in a state of war. They've held on to it. There's been no peace with the Palestinians, no 2 states for 2 people. Do you believe that Israel first needs to end the occupation in order to get peace?
Well, I think that there were Israeli governments that, as you might remember, tried it quite sincerely. Both the Barak government and the Ehud Olmert government tried to reach a settlement with the Palestinians and came very close to reaching it. The fact that it did not happen is a major tragedy. And the question today is whether we have the conditions, both politically, that is inside Israel and inside the Israeli polity, if the conditions exist for such a breakthrough. Seemingly, there is a readiness by the American administration to go ahead, to push forward the peace process. I have, however, my doubts if this is an administration that can persist in the inevitably tortuous process of ups and downs in this kind of negotiations, but where I think that the parties need to give it a try. Israel, let me tell you, I cannot vouch for the current government, obviously not. But the only thing I can tell you is that if you look at the history of the Zionist movement, of the Israeli or the Jewish national movement in modern times, you will see that this is a movement that was always about demography more than about territory. And the fact that the two stand in stark contradiction when it comes to the area between the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River, and the Mediterranean, you might see that there is an inherent interest of this particular national movement not to occupy land that will dilute the Jewish majority. That was the reason that Sharon disengaged from Gaza. That was the reason that brought Rabin into the peace process. That was the reason that brought Olmert into the peace process. So I still hope that the fear, the rejection of the idea of being diluted into an Arab majority, this is what might at some point bring the Israelis to understand there is no other way but to disengage from the territories.
Mm-hmm. Well, the way they seem to be dealing with it, and as you say, you're not going to vouch for the current government, but the way that Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to want to deal with it is by being firm. Now, in his opinion, he's keeping Israel safe, he's making Israel strong. He builds settlements, so that increases, I guess, geography and demography. It's a very militaristic approach. He pulverizes Gaza periodically as and when he needs to. He entrenches the occupation of the West Bank. With all of this in mind, 70 years on since the foundation of the State of Israel, when people look at this current policy of the Netanyahu government, how do you feel?
Well, I tend to agree more or less with what you say. As I said before, I can't vouch for this government, and judging by his policies, one can see that Netanyahu has two traits, two tactics, as it were, for maintaining himself in power, and both work against a viable peace process. One is that he has been building his political power on fear. I mean, if you look at all the electoral campaign, all the discourse, this is never a discourse of hope. It is a discourse of Israel surrounded by enemies. If it is not Hamas, it is Hezbollah. If it is not Hezbollah, it is Iran. That has been quite a persistent way that Netanyahu decided to build his political power base. And the second is that he behaves more as a politician than as a statesman. That is, he cares for his coalition. He caters to the necessity of his constituency, or his political constituency. And I have the view that a leader, wherever, in Israel, in Palestine, in Turkey, wherever, a leader that wants to create major changes and major breakthroughs in protracted situations, in protracted conflicts, in divisive conflicts such as the one we have with the Palestinians, he must at some point disengage from his political power base. Being so loyal to your political power base turns you into the hostage of your electoral campaign, and therefore you cannot really do the things that the nation needs. Again, Sharon, as you might remember, was the leader of Likud, but when he wanted to disengage from Gaza, he had to leave Likud. He had to create a different center-right instead of right-right coalition. So I think that these two things, Netanyahu's main preoccupation with its political power base, instead of thinking broadly, is, in my view, one of the major reasons that we cannot have in this kind of government any kind of breakthrough with the Palestinians.
But you say it's a preoccupation with his political power base. Others would look at it and say this is what the majority wants. Why would he need to change anything if this is what the electorate wants? He's reflecting the will of the people, and the people want a strong leader who enforces the status quo.
Well, you have a very good point here. Nonetheless, you see, opinion is movable. It can shift. Opinion doesn't, Israelis do not wake up in the morning and ask themselves, what are we going to do with the Palestinians? Whether are we going to withdraw, create a Palestinian state, divide, yes or no, Jerusalem? You know, when we were in government and we went to Camp David, before we started the summit, only 5% of the Israelis were ready to consider dividing Jerusalem. Polls showed that when we came back from this rather pedagogic sort of essay in political pedagogic sort of essay in Camp David, the opinion shifted and people around 30% and 40% were ready for that. If you conduct a poll now in Israel, you will discover that the majority of Israelis would agree to a Palestinian state. They do not trust the Palestinians. They would be very comfortable with a prime minister that doesn't push too much for a settlement. So it depends on leadership. It depends on leadership to shape opinion, to explain why this is so important for us as a nation. And this is exactly what Netanyahu doesn't do. But opinion is not the problem. You see, only 30%, Netanyahu has 30 seats in a parliament of 120. So Netanyahu himself as a leader, this is what he has, a quarter of the nation. The question is, what kind of coalition you build? Whom do you bring in? Whom you relinquish as a partner? And this is his choice. I mean, he decided to have this coalition with the Jewish Home and with Lieberman and the rest of it. He could have done it differently.
My final question to you, sir. The Israelis want peace, no doubt. Palestinians want justice. Are the two compatible at all, and is that why this is so intractable?
Well, peace and justice are not always cannot always coincide. You know, the kind of justice that some of the Palestinians want is impossible. You need to draw a line between peace and justice, to sacrifice some of the justice in order to have peace. Full justice is a recipe for not having peace. And if you look at the Palestinian tragedy, it is a major tragedy. It is a tragedy of almost cosmic dimensions. And they always had a problem to translate this right that they have into a political settlement. After all, we are talking about a Palestinian state that will be more or less 6,000 kilometers square, sandwiched between two states that do not suffer from an excess of love to the Palestinian cause. One is Jordan, another Israel. So it is not particularly attractive. And I could see it personally whenever the Palestinians came close to a settlement, whenever they came with an Israeli partner to a viable deal, to something that looked as a dignified deal, they retracted. They did not cross the river. We could turn the ocean that divides us into a river, but they did not cross it. It happened to us when the Clinton peace parameters were rejected by the Palestinian side, and it happened to Olmert. the position of the Palestinians is normally, yes, that was the last thing that the Prime Minister was doing. He was very weak politically. Olmert was about to stand he was under investigation for some criminal activities that he has done, etc., etc. And I always say, listen, the Israeli Prime Minister, if you know well the Israeli mind, the Israeli psyche, the Israeli political system, you will understand that every Israeli Prime Minister, when he puts a forward-looking, an extremely forward-looking peace proposal on the table, this will always be the last thing he will be doing as a Prime Minister. Because people want peace, but they are not very happy with the price. Everybody wants peace. The problem is the price. And if the price is such that it divides Jerusalem, it allows for some kind of even symbolic right of return, it dismantles scores of settlements, it creates a political earthquake. It is so difficult that he will not be able to sustain it. But then if the Palestinian side decides to accept the proposal, even if it is not signed, even if it is not implemented, it becomes the internationally recognized reference for a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. And it is a pity that they always found a reason why not.
Right.
Arafat was looking for George W. Bush. He believed that George W. Bush was the son of George Bush, father.
Right.
The political son, that is.
Mr.
But he was not the political son. He was one of the staunchest Zionists in the White House.
I've got to jump in.
Conditions change.
So I wish we could go on, but I've got to wrap. Sir, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Shlomo Ben-Ami, former Israeli foreign minister. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.